She doesn't belong in this neighborhood. The words cut through the wedding music sharper than the violin strings drifting across the garden. For one strange second, everything seemed to stop at once. The laughter near the champagne table faded. The soft clinking of crystal glasses disappeared. Even the breeze moving through the white roses along the stone pathway felt colder somehow. Naomi Carter stood beneath a canopy of warm hanging lights, her fingers tightening around the bouquet of ivory peonies pressed against her satin dress. The veil resting over her shoulders fluttered gently in the evening wind as 4 police cruisers rolled slowly toward the front gates of the estate. Red and blue lights flashed against the marble fountain, staining the wedding decorations in pulses of color that didn't belong there. Guests began turning their heads one by one. Conversations dropped into whispers. Somewhere near the back row, a little girl holding flower petals grabbed her mother's hand and asked quietly if something bad was happening. Naomi swallowed hard and tried to steady her breathing. Just 10 seconds earlier, the wedding had felt perfect. The late summer air carried the smell of fresh magnolias and candle wax. Jazz music floated softly beneath the glowing string lights stretched across the backyard terrace. Every table shimmered beneath gold-trimmed centerpieces she had spent 6 months designing herself. 6 months of planning every flower, every chair, every ribbon tied around every guest napkin, because Naomi Carter had built her entire life around making beautiful moments for other people. And tonight was finally supposed to be hers. Then the voice came again. Loud, sharp, deliberate. "Officer, that woman is trespassing on private property." Naomi slowly turned toward the edge of the neighboring fence line, where Margaret Holloway stood with her arms folded tightly across her pale cashmere sweater. The older white woman looked perfectly composed beneath the porch lantern glowing behind her, but her eyes carried something colder than anger. Disgust. The kind Naomi had seen before. The kind that made people stare too long at restaurants or clutch their purses. Tighter in elevators. Margaret pointed directly toward Naomi without hesitation. "I've lived here 22 years, she continued loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And I know every family on this street. I've never seen her before in my life." A murmur spread through the crowd. Naomi felt heat crawl slowly up her neck, but she kept her posture still. Calm. Always calm. That was how her father taught her to survive moments like this. Never give people the reaction they came looking for. One of the officers stepped forward carefully, resting a hand near his belt, but keeping his tone neutral. "Ma'am," he said to Naomi, "can you confirm you have permission to hold this event here tonight?" The question landed like a slap without ever becoming one. Naomi blinked once. Around her, guests exchanged uncertain looks. A bridesmaid shifted uncomfortably beside the aisle candles. The wedding planner and Naomi noticed absurd details even now. One centerpiece slightly crooked near table 7, one candle flickering too low near the dance floor. Her mind grabbed tiny things because the bigger reality felt impossible. This was her wedding. Her wedding. And suddenly she was being treated like she had wandered into someone else's life by mistake. Margaret gave a small, humorless laugh from across the fence. "That's exactly what I was trying to explain." Naomi looked down briefly at the engagement ring resting against her trembling fingers. The diamond caught the police lights for a split second before disappearing back into shadow. Somewhere above the garden, thunder rumbled softly in the distance even though the sky remained clear. The music had stopped completely now. All that remained was the sound of cicadas humming in the dark and the faint crackle of police radios near the gate. Naomi lifted her chin slowly and looked directly at the officer. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, but steady enough to carry across the silent garden. "Officer," she said softly, "today was supposed to be about love." For a long moment, "Nobody," answered Naomi. The officer standing near the aisle shifted his weight slightly, uncertainty flickering across his face as the wedding guests waited in uncomfortable silence. Somewhere near the catering tables, ice clinked softly inside untouched glasses of lemonade. The warm glow from the hanging lanterns painted gold across Naomi's skin, but it did nothing to stop the cold feeling spreading through her chest. She could feel dozens of eyes studying her now, trying to understand the situation before deciding which side to believe. That part hurt more than she expected, because Naomi Carter had spent her entire life learning how quickly people questioned a black woman's right to belong somewhere beautiful. She knew the look, the hesitation, the silent math people did in their heads the moment they saw her standing inside expensive spaces wearing elegance too confidently. It had happened when she booked luxury venues for clients. It had happened during meetings where hotel managers assumed she was part of the cleaning staff instead of the event coordinator. Once, 3 years earlier, a country club receptionist handed her a service entrance map before realizing Naomi was there to organize a senator's anniversary gala. Even now, dressed in a custom ivory gown with delicate pearl stitching across the sleeves, she could still feel old memories pressing against her ribs like stones. Margaret Holloway remained near the fence with the rigid posture of someone convinced she was protecting something important. Her silver bracelet glimmered beneath the porch light each time she folded her arms tighter. "I am simply trying to keep this neighborhood safe," she said loudly. "People spend millions to live here." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Millions. The word lingered bitterly in the air because people like Margaret always spoke about neighborhoods the same way they spoke about private clubs. Exclusive, protected, carefully filtered. Naomi understood exactly what Margaret meant without her saying it directly. A soft breeze drifted through the garden again, carrying the scent of roses and fresh rain from somewhere far away. Naomi looked toward the rows of white chairs lining the aisle. Every ribbon tied around them had been done by hand. Her hand. 2 nights earlier she had stayed awake until nearly 3 in the morning arranging candles herself because she wanted every guest to feel warmth the second they walked into the garden. That was who Naomi was. She built comfort for people, beauty for people. She remembered growing up in a small apartment on the south side of Baltimore, where her mother worked double shifts at a nursing home while her father drove city buses 6 days a week. Money had always been tight, but love never was. Her mother used to iron church dresses on the kitchen counter while humming old gospel songs through the apartment. Her father believed deeply in dignity. "Never let bitterness change the softness in your heart," he always told her. Naomi carried those words everywhere. Even after years of rejection, even after clients looked surprised hearing her speak fluent French during destination wedding calls, even after investors laughed politely when she pitched her event company the first time, she kept going, quietly, patiently, building one wedding at a time until Naomi Carter Events became known for transforming ordinary spaces into something magical. One officer glanced toward the estate gates, then back at Naomi again. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we just need confirmation from the property owner." Naomi nodded once, though her throat suddenly felt tight. Around her, whispers continued moving through the guests like wind through dry leaves. A bridesmaid dabbed nervously beneath her eyes. One older couple near the back stood frozen beside the dessert table, unsure whether to leave or stay. Naomi felt humiliation creeping slowly into the perfect evening she had spent months creating. Yet somehow she still stood straight, still calm, still graceful beneath the flashing police lights washing across the wedding flowers. Because deep down, Naomi refused to let this moment turn her into someone hard. Margaret Holloway stepped forward before the officers could respond again, her polished heels clicking softly against the stone pathway, separating her property from the wedding garden. The sound echoed strangely in the silence, precise and cold like everything else about her. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. Immediately, her blonde hair rested perfectly above the collar of her cream-colored coat despite the wind beginning to move through the trees overhead. Naomi noticed small details instinctively, maybe because years in the wedding business had trained her to read people through posture, fabric, tone, and silence. Margaret was not nervous. She was offended, deeply offended. "I warned the Homeowners Association this would happen," Margaret said, looking toward the officers instead of Naomi now. Cars lining the street. Loud music. Strangers wandering through private property. This neighborhood was never designed for events like this. Events like this. The phrase landed heavily beneath the hanging lights. Naomi felt several guests glance downward uncomfortably. Others stared openly at Margaret in disbelief, but no one interrupted her. Not yet. One of the officers cleared his throat carefully. "Ma'am, we are only here to verify the complaint." Margaret gave a sharp nod. Good. Because somebody clearly lied to gain access to this estate. Naomi could hear her maid of honor inhale softly beside her. Danielle reached for Naomi's arm for half a second before stopping herself, almost afraid that any sudden movement might make the situation worse. Naomi appreciated the restraint. Tension had spread across the garden now like invisible smoke. The candles flickered harder as the wind strengthened, bending the flames sideways. Somewhere near the entrance gate, one valet quietly lowered his eyes and stepped back toward the parked vehicles, sensing trouble before fully understanding it. Margaret looked directly at Naomi again. "You know," she said calmly, "when I first saw the setup yesterday, I honestly assumed you were part of the catering staff." A few people gasped quietly. Naomi felt the words strike somewhere deep beneath her ribs, not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Too familiar. She remembered standing inside luxury ballrooms where wealthy clients mistook her for hotel service workers even while she carried planning binders in her hands. She remembered arriving at vendor meetings only to be asked where the actual coordinator was. Once, during a celebrity wedding in Charleston, a florist had handed Naomi a trash bag and asked her to help clear tables before realizing she owned the company running the entire event. The humiliation never arrived loudly. It arrived softly, constantly, like water slowly wearing down stone. Naomi lowered her bouquet slightly and looked toward the rows of guests seated beneath the glowing lights. Friends, family, couples she had once helped marry. A retired teacher, she organized a free anniversary ceremony for after her husband survived cancer. A military couple who could not afford a reception until Naomi donated one herself. They all sat frozen now beneath flashing police lights while Margaret Holloway dismantled the evening piece by piece with polished words and practiced suspicion. This community values standards, Margaret continued. People work hard their entire lives to live somewhere peaceful. Naomi noticed the subtle emphasis again. Somewhere peaceful. She understood exactly what Margaret believed peace looked like. One of the younger officers shifted awkwardly and glanced around the estate. The property itself stretched beautifully beneath the evening sky. Massive oak trees lined the garden. White marble statues reflected soft amber lighting near the fountain. Every detail whispered wealth, so effortlessly it almost looked unreal beneath the police lights staining the driveway blue and red. Naomi suddenly realized what Margaret could not comprehend. It was not just the wedding itself that disturbed her. It was seeing a black woman standing at the center of elegance she believed belonged to someone else. Thunder rolled again faintly across the distance. This time closer. Naomi could smell rain beginning to gather in the humid Georgia air. Her fingers tightened once more around the bouquet stems as one officer finally spoke into his radio, requesting confirmation from the estate owner. The static crackling through the silence sounded unbearably loud. The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled softly, then fell silent again without an answer. That silence seemed to stretch across the entire estate. Naomi could hear the fountain water moving behind her now, steady and calm against the rising tension tightening every face in the garden. The sky above the oak trees had darkened into deep navy blue, and the hanging lights overhead glowed warmer against the coming storm. One of the officers glanced down at his watch before speaking carefully. "Ma'am, until we confirm ownership, we may need to pause the event temporarily." A soft wave of disbelief moved through the guests. Someone near the back whispered, "This cannot be happening." Naomi felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression composed. Years ago, her grandmother once told her that grace was not tested during easy moments. Grace revealed itself when humiliation arrived publicly. Naomi understood those words now more than ever. Margaret Holloway adjusted the collar of her coat and stepped slightly closer to the fence line, satisfaction flickering briefly across her face. "Honestly," she said, "this should have been handled before all these people showed up." Her voice carried easily through the garden. "You cannot simply throw a party in a neighborhood like this and expect no questions." Danielle finally took a step forward beside Naomi. "This is not a party," she snapped quietly. "It is a wedding." Margaret barely looked at her. Then perhaps the bride should have chosen a venue that actually belonged to her. The words settled into the evening air like ash. Naomi saw several guests lower their eyes immediately. A man near the second row removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead slowly, clearly uncomfortable. The little flower girl holding petals had started crying softly into her mother's shoulder now, frightened by the flashing police lights and the tension she did not fully understand. Naomi looked at the child for a moment and felt something ache inside her chest. This was exactly what she never wanted weddings to become. Fear, division, shame. She slowly handed her bouquet to Danielle and stepped forward before anyone else could speak. The satin fabric of her gown brushed softly against the stone walkway as she approached the nearest officer. "Please," Naomi said gently, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening beneath it. "There are children here." The officer's expression softened slightly. "I understand, ma'am." "No," Margaret interrupted sharply. "What you need to understand is that these situations escalate when people refuse to cooperate." Naomi turned toward her slowly. The wind lifted the edge of her veil again, moving strands of dark hair across her cheek beneath the garden lights. "I have cooperated," Naomi answered quietly. "From the moment you called the police on my wedding." Margaret gave a small dismissive laugh. "Your wedding?" She looked around the estate dramatically. "You really expect people to believe this place belongs to you?" Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the massive white estate behind the garden. The tall windows reflected the police lights in fractured flashes of blue and red. Upstairs, the curtains near one balcony shifted slightly from the wind drifting through an open door. The house stood silent, waiting. Naomi suddenly became aware of how alone she looked standing there beneath the lights. No groom beside her. No music. No vows exchanged. Just officers, whispers, and a neighborhood watching her existence become a question mark. One officer spoke softly into his radio again, requesting immediate confirmation from the property owner. Static answered him once more. Then silence. Margaret folded her arms tighter. "That is what I thought," she said coldly. "Nobody legitimate would leave a bride standing here alone like this." Naomi felt those words strike deeper than the others because for one painful second, doubt crept quietly into the corners of her mind too. She glanced toward the driveway instinctively, searching the darkness beyond the gate. Empty. No headlights. No movement. Just rain beginning to tap softly against the leaves overhead. The first drops touched the white fabric of her veil like tiny pieces of ice. Rain began falling harder across the estate, soft at first, then steady enough to ripple the surface of the marble fountain behind the wedding aisle. The warm lantern lights hanging above the garden shimmered through the rain like fading gold stars, beautiful and fragile at the same time. Naomi stood motionless beneath them, her white gown slowly catching droplets along the hem, while guests shifted uneasily beneath umbrellas and covered tables. Nobody knew what to say anymore. The silence had become too heavy for ordinary conversation. One officer finally lowered the radio from his shoulder with visible frustration. "We still cannot reach the property owner," he admitted carefully. Margaret Holloway gave a slow nod as if she had expected exactly that answer all along. "Then I think it is obvious what is happening here," she said. "These people need to leave." The word people hit differently now. Sharper. More deliberate. Naomi noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. Danielle stepped forward again, disbelief written across her face. "You called the police because black people were celebrating a wedding next door?" Margaret's expression hardened instantly. "Do not twist my words." "I do not have to," Danielle replied quietly. "Everybody here heard you." The tension snapped tighter across the garden. One older guest quietly guided the flower girl toward the covered patio to keep her out of the rain, while several others stood frozen near the dance floor, unsure whether they were witnessing discrimination, humiliation, or something worse. Naomi could feel every second stretching painfully longer. Her makeup remained flawless despite the rain gathering along her lashes, but inside, exhaustion had started creeping into her chest. She had spent her entire career creating moments where people felt safe enough to love openly. Tonight, standing in her own wedding dress beneath flashing police lights, she suddenly understood how quickly dignity could be stolen from a room. One officer glanced toward Naomi apologetically. "Ma'am," he said softly, "without confirmation, we may have to ask everyone to clear the property temporarily until this situation is resolved." The words landed like a final crack through the evening. A bridesmaid covered her mouth in shock. Someone near the back muttered, "Oh my God." Naomi lowered her eyes for the first time all night. Just for 1 second. Just long enough for the hurt to show. Rain tapped steadily against the fabric of her veil now, tiny cold drops. sliding down the satin sleeves of her dress. She thought about the months spent planning this night, the tasting appointments, the seating charts, the handwritten vows folded carefully upstairs inside the bridal suite. She thought about her father crying quietly during rehearsal dinner because he never imagined his daughter would one day stand inside a place this beautiful being loved this fully. And now strangers were trying to erase all of it in front of everyone she cared about. Margaret crossed her arms tighter as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. This neighborhood has standards, she repeated coldly. People cannot simply come in here and pretend. Naomi slowly lifted her head again. Her eyes glistened beneath the lights, but her voice remained calm. Pretend what? She asked quietly. Margaret hesitated only briefly. Pretend they belong. The words settled over the garden like smoke. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Naomi felt the sting of humiliation spread through her chest. But deeper than that was something else now. Sadness. Because Margaret genuinely believed she was protecting something valuable instead of destroying something sacred. One of the officers looked visibly uncomfortable. Another glanced toward the estate driveway again as rain continued falling harder against the stone entrance. Then suddenly, through the curtain of rain and darkness beyond the gate, headlights appeared. Bright. Slow. Approaching. The glow swept across the soaked hedges and marble pillars at the front of the property, while every face in the garden turned toward the driveway at once. Margaret frowned slightly. The officers straightened instinctively, and Naomi's heartbeat stopped for just one impossible second. The headlights moved slowly through the rain like glowing shadows cutting across the darkness beyond the estate gates. Water shimmered on the long driveway as a line of black SUVs rolled silently toward the garden, their tires crunching softly against wet gravel. Nobody spoke. Even Margaret Holloway stopped moving for the first time all evening. The police officers instinctively straightened their posture as the vehicles approached there. Flashing lights reflecting across the rain-soaked marble fountain and the rows of empty white chairs lining the aisle. Naomi stood perfectly still beneath the falling rain, her breathing shallow now, almost fragile. The veil clinging softly to her shoulders had become damp and heavy, but she barely noticed anymore. Her eyes remained fixed on the approaching convoy as memories began moving quietly through her mind. She remembered the first time Elijah Bennett took her hand 2 years earlier after a charity gala downtown. She had been cleaning flower arrangements alone after midnight because half the staff had gone home sick, and he stayed behind to help her carry folding chairs into storage instead of leaving with the politicians waiting for him outside. Most powerful men spent their lives trying to be seen. Elijah had always been different. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered names. He asked questions and actually waited for answers. When Naomi once told him she felt invisible in certain rooms, he looked at her for a long moment and said softly, "Then those rooms do not deserve you." The memory tightened something warm and painful inside her chest now. Rain tapped steadily against the garden umbrellas while the first SUV finally stopped near the front pathway. One officer stepped back immediately. Another adjusted his uniform nervously. Margaret frowned, confusion replacing confidence across her face for the first time all night. The rear passenger door opened slowly. A polished black shoe touched the wet pavement first. Then a tall figure emerged beneath the rain. Dark overcoat, broad shoulders, calm posture. Naomi felt her heartbeat stumble inside her chest. Elijah Bennett looked exactly the same as he had earlier that morning before leaving for an emergency city meeting. Steady, grounded, the kind of presence that quieted rooms without effort. Rain slid down the shoulders of his coat as he took in the scene before him. The police cars, the frightened guests, Naomi standing alone beneath the wedding canopy. And something shifted in his expression immediately. Not anger, hurt, deep quiet hurt. One of the officers spoke first, his voice suddenly formal. "Mr. Mayor." The words seemed to freeze the entire garden. Margaret Holloway blinked once, then twice, as if her mind physically could not process what she had just heard. Nearby guests exchanged stunned looks. Danielle covered her mouth with both hands. Naomi simply stared at Elijah through the rain, emotion rising so quickly inside her chest she could barely breathe around it. Elijah walked forward slowly across the stone pathway, while water glimmered beneath each step. The officers moved aside without being asked. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. The same space that had treated Naomi like an intruder only moments earlier now shifted instantly around his presence. That realization hurt almost as much as everything else. Elijah stopped directly in front of Naomi beneath the canopy lights. Rainwater slid slowly from the edge of his coat sleeve as his eyes searched her face carefully, taking in every detail. The trembling bouquet now resting beside the aisle. The damp veil, the exhaustion hiding behind her composure. His voice came low and gentle. "Baby," he said softly, "I am so sorry I am late." Naomi's lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Around them, the garden remained silent except for the sound of rain falling against leaves and distant thunder rolling beyond the estate walls. Margaret Holloway stood near the fence, completely motionless now, her face drained of color beneath the porch light. The officers no longer looked at Naomi with suspicion. They looked at her with sudden respect. And somehow that change said everything. No one moved after the officer said the words, "Mr. Mayor." The rain continued falling softly across the estate, tapping against umbrellas, soaking flower petals scattered along the aisle, turning the marble pathways dark beneath the lantern glow. Elijah Bennett stood beside Naomi beneath the wedding canopy, his jaw tight as he slowly looked around at the scene surrounding her. For police cruisers, nervous guests, bridesmaids with tears in their eyes, and Naomi standing there alone in a wedding dress, while strangers questioned whether she belonged in the very place he had chosen for their marriage. Elijah inhaled slowly through his nose before turning toward the officers. His voice remained calm, but there was weight inside it now. "Can someone explain to me," he said quietly, "why my fiancé was being treated like a trespasser at her own wedding?" The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances immediately. The older one removed his hat respectfully. "Sir, we received a complaint regarding unauthorized use of the property." Elijah looked toward the estate behind them. Rainwater rolled down the massive windows while warm lights still glowed from inside the mansion. "I own this property," Elijah answered evenly. "The event permits were approved 3 weeks ago through the city." Silence, heavy and immediate. Margaret Holloway's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out at first. Her confidence had vanished so completely, it almost looked unreal. Just 20 minutes earlier, she stood at the fence speaking like a gatekeeper protecting her world. Now she looked like someone watching the ground disappear beneath her feet. Elijah finally turned toward her fully. Not angry, not loud. Somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. "Mrs. Holloway," he said softly, "did you call the police on my wedding?" Margaret swallowed visibly beneath the porch light across the property line. I did not know." Elijah nodded once before she could finish. "That Naomi lived here?" Margaret's face flushed deeply. Rain slid down the edge of her hair as she struggled for words. "I believed something suspicious was happening." Elijah glanced briefly toward the guests still standing quietly beneath umbrellas and covered tables. "Suspicious," he repeated softly. Then his eyes returned to Naomi for a moment. The sadness in his expression deepened. "Do you know how many times people looked at this woman and assumed she did not belong somewhere?" Margaret lowered her gaze immediately. Nobody interrupted him. Even the officers remained silent now beneath the flashing lights fading against the rain. Elijah stepped slightly closer to Naomi, his voice quieter than before. "You know what is extraordinary?" he continued. "She still spends her life helping people celebrate love anyway." Naomi looked down for a second, emotion tightening her throat again. Elijah gently took her hand in his. Warm, steady, familiar. "This woman built scholarship funds for single mothers through her business," he said. "She organized free weddings for military families who could not afford ceremonies after deployment. She spent Christmas morning last year decorating a hospital chapel so a dying man could renew vows with his wife before surgery." Margaret's shoulders slowly dropped lower with every sentence. The rain no longer mattered. The neighborhood no longer mattered. Nothing remained except the uncomfortable truth sitting openly in the middle of the garden for everyone to see. Elijah's voice softened even further. "And tonight, instead of asking her name, instead of welcoming her, you saw a black woman standing inside wealth and assumed she must have been in the wrong place." Margaret finally whispered, barely audible beneath the rain. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes people become so focused on protecting neighborhoods that they forget to protect humanity. The words settled over the estate with devastating stillness. Naomi felt tears gather finally along her lashes, though she fought to hold them back. Not because she felt weak. Because for the first time all evening, someone had spoken the truth out loud without forcing her to defend her own dignity. Around them, guests stood silent beneath the rain, watching the entire balance of power shift without a single raised voice. The rain slowly began to soften, falling lighter now across the estate, as though the storm itself had grown tired of the tension hanging over the garden. Water dripped quietly from the edges of the wedding canopy while guests remained frozen in silence, still absorbing everything that had just unfolded. The police lights reflected dimly against the wet stone pathways, no longer aggressive now, just distant flashes fading into the background. Naomi stood beside Elijah beneath the lantern glow, her hand still resting inside his, warm and steady against the cold evening air. For the first time all night, she felt her breathing begin to slow. One of the officers stepped forward carefully and removed his hat again. "Mr. Mayor," he said respectfully, "we apologize for the misunderstanding." Elijah nodded once. "Thank you, officer." The man hesitated briefly before turning toward Naomi directly. "Ma'am," he added softly, "I am sorry your evening was interrupted." Naomi looked at him for a moment and gave a small, graceful nod. "Thank you for treating everyone calmly," she answered. Even now, after everything, her voice carried kindness inside it that seemed to affect the officers more than anger ever could have. Margaret Holloway remained near the fence line, her posture smaller somehow than before. The confidence she wore earlier had dissolved beneath the rain and silence. Her eyes stayed lowered toward the wet pavement while guests quietly watched her from across the garden. Naomi noticed something important then. Margaret did not look hateful anymore. She looked embarrassed. Human. Fragile in a way pride rarely allows people to admit. Elijah gently squeezed Naomi's hand. "We can ask everyone to leave if you want," he whispered quietly enough that only she could hear. Naomi looked around the estate slowly. The soaked flower arrangements. The flickering candles still refusing to go out despite the storm. Her bridesmaids standing nearby with worried eyes. The little flower girl peeking carefully from beneath her mother's umbrella. This night had almost been destroyed by fear and prejudice, and for one painful moment, Naomi had wanted to disappear inside the humiliation of it all. But standing there now beside the man she loved, she realized something deeper. If she allowed bitterness to become the final memory of this evening, then Margaret's fear would win twice. Naomi released a slow breath and stepped forward slightly beneath the canopy lights. "Mrs. Holloway," she said softly. Margaret looked up immediately, startled by the gentleness in Naomi's voice. Rainwater shimmered along the older woman's cheeks beneath the porch light. Naomi held her gaze calmly. "I know you thought you were protecting something tonight." Margaret opened her mouth slightly, as if preparing to defend herself again, but Naomi continued before she could speak. "But love does not damage neighborhoods." Silence settled across the garden once more. Softer this time. Naomi glanced around at the guests standing together beneath umbrellas and lanterns. Black families, white families, elderly couples, children, friends, different people from different worlds all gathered in one place because they cared about two human beings choosing each other. "This was never supposed to become a battle," Naomi said quietly. "It was supposed to become a memory." Margaret's eyes glistened now with visible shame. I misjudged you," she admitted weakly. Naomi paused for a moment before answering. "No," she said gently. "You misjudged what belonging looks like." The words did not sound cruel. That was what made them powerful. Elijah looked at Naomi with quiet admiration beside her. He had seen her organize charity events in impossible situations, comfort grieving brides after family tragedies, and rebuild broken celebrations with grace most people could never understand. But this moment felt different. Because forgiveness in front of humiliation required a kind of strength far deeper than anger. One by one, the officers returned to their vehicles. The flashing lights finally disappeared from the garden as engines started softly against the wet driveway. Guests slowly exhaled, like people waking from a nightmare. Somewhere near the patio, a violinist cautiously lifted his instrument again, uncertain whether the evening still deserved music. Naomi looked toward him through the rain and gave the smallest nod. The first notes of the violin drifted softly through the garden again, fragile at first, almost uncertain whether the night could still be saved. Rain continued falling lightly across the estate, but the storm had passed its worst. Water shimmered along the stone pathways beneath the lantern glow while guests slowly returned to their seats one by one, their movements quiet and careful, as if nobody wanted to disturb the peace settling gently back into place. Naomi stood beneath the wedding canopy beside Elijah, her fingers still wrapped around his hand. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other while the world around them slowly breathed again. Elijah lifted his free hand carefully and brushed a damp strand of hair away from Naomi's cheek. His touch was gentle enough to make her eyes close briefly beneath the warm lights overhead. "You okay?" he asked softly. Naomi let out the faintest laugh through the emotion still caught in her chest. "I think so." Elijah studied her face for another moment before shaking his head quietly. "You should never have had to stand alone through any of that." Naomi looked toward the guests gathered beneath umbrellas and candlelight. "I was not alone," she answered. "I just forgot for a minute." Somewhere nearby, Danielle sniffled loudly before laughing at herself through tears. A few guests smiled softly. The tension that had gripped the estate all evening finally began dissolving into something warmer now. Human again. Elijah glanced toward the officiant waiting patiently near the floral arch. "Do you still want to do this?" he asked. Naomi looked around at the rain-soaked flowers, the flickering candles stubbornly surviving the storm, the people who had stayed instead of leaving when things became uncomfortable. Then she looked back at Elijah. More than ever, a quiet murmur of relief and emotion spread through the garden. The violin music grew warmer as guests slowly settled back into their chairs. Someone relit several candles near the aisle. The flower girl returned carrying her basket again, this time smiling shyly beneath her tiny raincoat. Naomi picked up her bouquet from where Danielle had protected it beneath an umbrella, though several white petals had already fallen loose from the rain. Somehow that made it more beautiful. Real. Elijah offered Naomi his arm gently, and together they stepped toward the center of the ceremony space, while the estate glowed softly behind them beneath the storm-dark sky. Near the fence line, Margaret Holloway remained standing alone beneath her porch light. Her arms were no longer folded, her posture no longer defensive. She simply watched quietly from a distance while the wedding resumed without bitterness, without revenge, without humiliation returned back toward her. Naomi noticed her there for one brief moment. Their eyes met across the rain and lantern light. Naomi did not glare. She did not look triumphant. Instead, she gave the smallest nod before turning back toward the ceremony waiting ahead of her. That simple kindness seemed to affect Margaret more deeply than public embarrassment ever could have. The officiant opened his book carefully, smiling through visible emotion. Rain tapped softly against the canopy overhead while Elijah and Naomi faced each other beneath the glowing lights. The world beyond the estate suddenly felt very far away. No police radios. No whispers. No suspicion. Just two people standing together after surviving a moment that could have broken the entire night apart. Elijah took Naomi's hands fully in his and smiled quietly. "You know," he whispered, "this is still the most beautiful wedding I have ever seen." Naomi smiled back through tears finally escaping down her cheeks. Even after all that, Elijah nodded once. Especially after all that. The violin swelled gently beneath the rain while candlelight flickered across the wet garden like tiny stars refusing to go out. And somewhere beyond the estate walls, thunder faded slowly into silence.